Delegates, staff, and faculty advisors, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McMUN honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the land and waters on which we meet today. On behalf of the International Relations Student Association of McGill University's Board of Directors, members, alumni, and the McGill community, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the 32nd Annual McGill Model United Nations Assembly. Otherwise known as IRSAM Inc., the International Relations Student Association of McGill is the umbrella organization of McMUN. My name is Madeline Northfield, and I'm the president and CEO of IRSAM. In addition to being one of the largest student organizations on McGill campus, IRSAM is a federally incorporated not-for-profit corporation. As an organization focused on education and personal development, we encourage you to learn about the rich and engaging history of the land this conference takes place on. IRSAM and McMUN pride ourselves on facilitating a conference which is not only competitive and intellectually stimulating for all of our delegates, but also filled with fun. In the face of COVID-19 and the current era, these conversations are all that much more important, even if they do take place over Zoom. In a time of isolation and fear, IRSAM and McMUN are proud to create an environment where delegates are offered the opportunity to meet and engage with people they may not otherwise meet, from countries they may know very little about. Facilitating these introductions is something else that we are proud to do. I've been fortunate enough to participate in Model UN for 8 years and can attest to the opportunities it's awarded me and the incredible people I've gotten to meet along the way. For me, it was the relationships that Model UN brought that kept bringing me back to sleepless and stressful nights, many relationships which have gone on to be some of my most cherished. We have a unique opportunity this weekend to bring that opportunity to people from their homes and home countries, touching even more people and opening the MUN community to those who may otherwise have faced barriers of entry. Whether McMUN is your first or 100th Model United Nations conference, over the weekend you will have the opportunity to engage in simulating debate, which will not only strengthen your understanding of international affairs, but also further develop your ability to adapt, compromise, and pivot. I wish you all the best of luck in this endeavor, and am confident that this strength will serve you beyond the confines of Zoom this weekend. On that note, I can personally attest that both your secretariat and the entirety of the McMUN 2021 staff have worked very hard to create what I'm sure will be another exceptional conference full of truly unforgettable experiences. I have been privileged to get to work with some of them in a variety of capacities, and am truly in awe of the dedication, perseverance, and passion they bring to McMUN. It is now an honor to introduce the McMUN 2021's fearless leader. Nearly 4 years ago, I was randomly assigned to a double Dell partner for my first college Model UN conference, and since then, I have been lucky enough to watch her succeed, overcome, and empower people through every avenue. She is one of the most dedicated, compassionate individuals who brings an unparalleled fire to everything she does, and I'm very proud to call her my friend. Without further ado, please welcome McMUN 2021 Secretary General, Natalie Schaller.
Delegates, faculty advisors, staff, family, friends, and distinguished guests, welcome to Montreal, virtually. In more ways than one, McMUN 2021 looks quite different from previous editions of the conference. At the start of this year, we believed we would all be together at the Sheraton in downtown Montreal. Now, as we prepare to conduct diplomacy in new and innovative ways, it is safe to say that this has been an unpredictable year. Not only has this year been unpredictable, though, it has also presented unique challenges to all of us. More than anything, this pandemic has brought to light in our society many systems of oppression and inequity. With a heightened awareness of these systems, our Secretariat has worked diligently to ensure that this year's conference took such issues into account, primarily by expanding access to diplomacy and providing delegates and staff with opportunities to learn to be better advocates in their respective communities. McMUN 2021 aims to move diplomacy and collaboration beyond the Model UN context, working to put our diplomacy tools into practice and implementing sustainable change together. We are excited to offer you a McMUN centered on this mission in its 32nd iteration. We will continue to offer an array of exciting and challenging committees and uphold McMUN's tradition to excellence. This year, our committees will focus more on social justice issues, with bodies dedicated to discussing gender equality, the rights of persons with disabilities, the provision of healthcare in Canada, and even women's mobilization in post-1994 Rwanda. We hope that in these committees, delegates hone their skills in respectful and inclusive dialogue and gain new perspectives on these issues and more. In addition to our committees, we are excited to offer delegates a new workshop conducted in partnership with the International Youth Advisory Delegation, or IYAD, of the International Relations Students Association of McGill University. IYAD is a youth advisory team with special consultative status to the United Nations Economic and Social Council. This year, they are offering delegates a workshop on how to integrate youth perspectives and diverse voices into international policymaking at the United Nations, with a special emphasis on how to consider the systems of colonialism that are present in these international structures. You can find the recorded workshop on our website. In our out-of-committee programming, we want to provide delegates with an opportunity to connect with each other. For this reason, we will be transforming our Friday night pub crawl into a virtual crawl, where delegates can mingle in groups according to their hobbies, interests, and future aspirations, or even play games such as Settlers of Catan. As well, while we will all be missing an in-person McParty, McMUN's favorite DJ, Chris24, will be returning this year with an online stream. It is our hope that through these opportunities, we learn about the important nuances of critical issues, consider the importance of context in our advocacy, and learn how to engage in allyship. Finally, the innovations that make McMUN more equitable and inclusive require vision and hard work to realize. It takes driven, focused, and inspiring individuals in all aspects to carry these out. At the head of these improvements are the 13 secretariat measures I have the distinct pleasure of introducing. Megan Coulter, Chargé d'Affaires. Karen Kasabian, Chief of Staff. Jack Klein, Chief of Operations. Rachel Diot-Lyles, Director of Equity. Dove Ellis, Director of Events. Vivian Chiang, Director of Public Relations. Kennedy McKee-Braid, Deputy for External Outreach. Lauren Hill, Deputy for Multimedia. Dalton Liggett, Undersecretary General of Committee Affairs. Kainaz Gandhi, Deputy for General Assemblies and the Economic and Social Councils. Valeria Lau, Deputy for Specialized Agencies. Aaron Smith, Deputy for Crises. And Omar Nazir, Undersecretary General of Finance. While our full secretariat has never met in person, they have worked tirelessly over the past 10 months to adapt to an unpredictable year and ensure all conference participants feel welcomed and are given the opportunity to challenge, innovate, and empower. Thank you so much to all of them. At this time, I am extremely excited to introduce our Deputy for External Outreach, Kennedy McKee-Braid, to discuss our Global Leadership Forum, conference charities, and sponsors.
I'd like to take a few moments to tell you about some of the initiatives our team has been working on this year. Seeing the devastation that so many communities have faced throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the Secretariat decided early on that we wanted to emphasize and help support local organizations and advocacy work. While Māori UN may operate within an international and highly institutionalized framework, we recognize that advocacy often begins at the grassroots and local level. Within the Montreal context in particular, we wanted to acknowledge and support the work of Indigenous-led and focused organizations. As such, I am honored to introduce the organizations that McMUN will be fundraising for this year: the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal and Resilience Montreal. The Native Women's Shelter provides services and resources to Indigenous women and their children. The organization empowers and offers a safe environment for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis women and children to rebuild their lives. They also offer a wide range of programs and services related to outreach, addiction and mental health support, family care, and more. A Resilience Montreal, a collaboration between the Native Women's Shelter and the Nazareth community, is a day shelter in Montreal's Cabot Square, an area where a large population of unhoused Indigenous people gather. A Resilience offers food, shelter, and a variety of other services to anyone in need. Especially during the pandemic, these organizations have played an invaluable role in supporting Indigenous communities and unhoused populations. McMUN will be donating our fundraising proceeds equally between the two organizations. Delegates, staff, and anyone else who may be interested can donate on the McMUN website all weekend long. Another initiative near and dear to my heart is the Global Leadership Forum. Our annual panel event, usually hosted at the International Civil Aviation Organization headquarters in Montreal, may be taking place online this year, but nevertheless, we are so excited to discuss our theme, Grassroots Activism to Global Change. We'll hear from experts and activists about the importance of local advocacy work and how we can build bridges between these networks and institutions like the United Nations. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors and partners, Chef on Call, ALTO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the IRSAM Youth Advisory Delegation, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, and Canada's Department of Justice. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to one of our keynote speakers this year. First, you'll hear from Natan Obed, President of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, the national representational organization protecting and advancing the rights and interests of the 65,000 Inuit in Canada. President Obed has committed his career to advocacy and policy change, improving the health and well-being of Inuit.
I'm Natan Obed, President of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. I'm very pleased to be joining you today as part of your Model United Nations conference. I wish that I could be there in person. I want to start just by giving some perspective on who Inuit are. Inuit are one of the 3 Indigenous peoples recognized in Section 35 of Canada's Constitution, along with First Nations and Métis. It's also important before we start to recognize the terminology is problematic. Our rights exist as peoples globally within the United Nations construct of a self-determining peoples. Inuit fit squarely within that definition. So the idea that Canada or a province or territory might give rights to First Nations, Inuit, or Métis is a misnomer. That is actually not in any way in the power of the Canadian government or provinces and territories to deliver upon. It is their role to uphold our rights and to implement our rights. So a lot of the UN work that we do is in relation to the recognition of our existing rights, and then the interplay on the international level of those conversations that affect all Indigenous peoples across the globe versus the domestic implementation of United Nations declarations or conventions that must be implemented in this country if Canada is to live up to its stated level of ambition, or whether or not the country has signed on to a convention or a declaration in the UN construct. Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, or ITK, is the national Inuit representational voice for Canada's 65,000 Inuit. This is a governance model in its own right. Our organization is directed by the presidents of the 4 regional land claim organizations, who are then in turn democratically elected by their respective Inuit within their respective regions. We talk about beneficiaries of land claim agreements, and the terminology that we're using is basically in the lens of Canada's modern treaties, those agreements that were signed after the Calder case in the early 70s and are called land claim agreements, very simply put, but modern treaties in other places, because Canada signed a number of historic treaties, especially with First Nations, and they have a different life and a different administrative structure on their own. We call our homeland Inuit Nunangat, and there's 51 communities spanning the Inuvialuit settlement region in the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, of course, in the territory of Nunavut, Nunavik in the northern part of Quebec, and Nunatsiavut in the northern part of Labrador. Inuit Nunangat makes up approximately 1/3 of Canada's landmass and more than 70% of Canada's coastline. Inuit also live in northern Alaska and in Greenland. We are collectively the largest private landowners in Canada and among the largest private landowners in the world. The space that I mentioned, approximately 1/3 of Canada's landmass, it also is contiguous, meaning that it is a geopolitical space that is not interrupted by other geopolitical spaces. So from northern Labrador to northern Quebec to Nunavut to the northern part of the Northwest Territories, Inuit have agreements that encompass all of that space. We've talked a lot as Inuit about figuring out how to create an Inuit Nunangat policy space so that decisions by the federal government and then also decisions that Canada makes are at least thinking about the Inuit Nunangat space as a major consideration in the way in which Canadian positions are created, the way that legislation and policy then flows from that consideration. In many cases, it's just opening our eyes as Canadians to a new way of seeing Canada. Reconciliation has brought about this reality in many different ways, but for the Inuit reality, it really is about, first and foremost, seeing just how much of this country is at least co-managed by Inuit, and how much of our sovereignty, how much of our natural resources, how much of our fresh water, how much of our coastline is dominated by Inuit considerations. We have this homeland that we now call Inuit Nunangat in a geopolitical sense only because Inuit fought hard from the 1960s until present day to settle these land claim agreements and also to go to the Supreme Court and fight nationally through the 70s and 80s and 90s to create spaces where Inuit can self-determine or create public governments like Nunavut, in which Inuit can be the majority population within a public government jurisdiction. We at ITK work to advance Inuit priorities in Canada, and we do that primarily through research and advocacy, as well as through administration of national initiatives and also communications. This is a part of my communications job in many ways, to try to inform Canadians about Inuit and about Inuit priorities, and also just in the way in which Inuit do fit within the political sense, but also our aspirations for the future. Our work on our priorities is often connected to the work of UN agencies. Canada has ratified binding international treaties such as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Paris Agreement. I was fortunate to be a part of that negotiation. It was really my second month on the job when I was in Paris in 2015. And it was exciting to be a part of that, but also there was a real sense that there is going to be an evolution of thought about the way Indigenous peoples interact with nation states at the international level. Often we as Indigenous peoples can only provide as much input as the nation states in which we live allow us to. So Canada always holds the floor. Perhaps sometimes it will provide perspectives of Indigenous peoples within that particular consideration when it does have the mic. But Indigenous peoples ourselves do not have standing in the way nation states do. That was a time where I was very pleased that our positions aligned so that Canada was one of the leaders to finalize the Paris Agreement. And I'll be thankful for Minister McKenna for all of her leadership throughout that time. But there's still so much that we could do to be a participant and a contributor at the international stage when it comes to the recognition and implementation of our rights. We've leveraged these opportunities that we've had with Canada and also through our international arm, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, to create tools that help ensure that Canada is discharging its legal obligations to Inuit. The challenges faced by our people are significant. Our life expectancy is a full 10 years less than other Canadians. Our communities face extensive barriers to employment and other socioeconomic considerations. And our basic human rights, including those in relation to housing, access to drinking water, and food security, are sometimes not upheld. These issues cannot be remedied through existing policy mechanisms alone. In our work, ITK has sought to transform the way governments engage with Inuit and to change mechanisms that contribute to the marginalization of Inuit. For example, in 2017, we successfully lobbied the federal government to establish the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee, which brings together the Inuit leadership who direct ITK's work and federal cabinet ministers. It's co-chaired by the Prime Minister and myself. This work of the committee is structured by specific topic area work plans developed by Inuit and federal officials that can contain key deliverables. Work plans are reviewed and revised annually to ensure that they're being implemented. So we have 3 meetings a year, every year, of this Inuit Crown Partnership, 2 between ministers and Inuit leadership, and 1 that includes the Prime Minister. We've tried to align our work with federal budget cycles to maximize the ability to influence Canada's considerations for the implementation of our shared responsibilities and our shared rights. The establishment of the ICPC marks a positive and fundamental paradigm shift, moving from a colonial framework to one of partnership, where respect and support for our rights to self-determination drives decision-making. We need to change the way that we imagine the work being done. We need to understand that Indigenous peoples have rights and that there then by necessity needs to be a different way of doing business. For decades, in some cases over 100 years, the complete power and control over our rights, our lives, and the way in which we access programs and services that were meant for Indigenous people or for Canadians as a whole were funneled through a lens of control and not through a lens of partnership. And it's going to take a long time for us to dismantle this work, but I think that it's possible. The results of this, if we are able to do this successfully, are that policies are not only more effective and impactful, but also more cost effective. empower Inuit or First Nations or Métis in self-determination. As crass as it sounds, that is also a cost savings. In the end, it's also going to lead to much more productivity of the country as a whole. And there's really not a lot of bad that you can see within that. To give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about, I'll talk about public housing. For years, federal investments in public housing intended for Inuit communities was allocated to provincial and territorial governments, causing lag times in construction and sometimes the reprofiling of funds that were intended to go to Inuit communities to go to other purposes. There's also the administration costs that were then applied to the funds as they flowed through an extra layer of administration on the way to Inuit housing purposes. But through the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee, we were able to ensure that the 2016 budget allocated public housing dollars directly to Inuit representational organizations, enabling our institutions to rapidly draw down directly from the federal investment in public housing. It also means that we are in control and self-determining how we spend those funds and how we allocate them. The terms and conditions on who is eligible, which communities will get the certain number of houses, how they'll be administered. These are the very real ways in which self-determination comes into being. We need to build the momentum that we've started, and we cannot go back to the places where we were even 10 years ago when it comes to the approach of Canada and provinces and territories in relationship to Indigenous rights. Our success as Inuit in working with governments to positively change our day-to-day realities in communities, whether on housing or mental health services or infrastructure, too often comes down to that temperamental approach by personalities, individual ministers, and individual bureaucrats. I want to thank you all for listening. I also wish that I was here in person. Part of the job that I enjoy the most is being able to talk and engage in conversation and learn, and also help in the learning process of many people. And so I look forward to further interactions, and thank you again for the invitation. Nakumi.
Thank you, President Obed. Now, I'm excited to present a keynote discussion between President Obed and Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada, David Lametti, who will discuss centering Indigenous perspectives in policymaking.
My first question is, how does Canada's history of inequity perpetrated by racist and destructive policies, such as the Indian Act and historical treaties, impact Indigenous communities today?
I'll start. I think that the complexity that I have to do my job in, the inability for average Canadians to understand Indigenous people's rights or Indigenous policy is purposeful. It isn't applied equally. And it also has been random in many ways through Supreme Court rulings, specific legislation, specific policies over the last 150 years that have created just strange realities for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in this country. If you think about the Inuit experience, we have a homogeneous space within Inuit Nunagat. We have a contiguous space from Northern Labrador through Northern Quebec, Nunavut to the Northwest Territories. But the policies around our life, the administration of our lives, and the respect for our rights has been hugely influenced by the provinces and territories in which we find ourselves within at any given moment. I just think about Zebedee Nungak's writings. He's a leader from Nunavik, from northern Quebec, and talking about the influence that the negative impacts, I should say, of the movement of northern Quebec, Nunavik, into Quebec and out of the Northwest Territories. And then the unwillingness of the province of Quebec for decades to provide any services to Inuit in Nunavik because of the squabbles that Nunavik had then with the federal government around jurisdiction over Indigenous peoples. In the end, who suffered? Inuit suffered, and suffered greatly. And that is just a small example of how government policy, government legislation, and I guess the dispossession of Inuit rights and our self-determination impacts us to this day. We're still trying to figure out how to work with the Canadian justice system, legal system, and then the Constitution to figure out how we can navigate towards self-determination and away from these colonial practices. I have so many examples that I could share, but I think it just bears to be said again, the way in which we were colonized, who colonized us, the jurisdictions that we were put in, the rules that we were forced to follow are not universal across our homeland. And just, I think of my name. My name is Natan Obed. It's a very traditional Nunatsiavut Inuit name. It's very Old Testament. It's I went to a school that had a large Jewish population in Boston, Tufts University. People thought I was Jewish. People thought I was from Israel because that's the only other place where that name is something that is a normalized name. Why do I have that name? Because Moravian missionaries in the 1700s colonized Inuit. And over the next 250 years, we have taken on a lot of their beliefs and a lot of their practices, including a lot of our names. So that's just all these wrinkles, our lived reality, our histories are all influenced by these, I guess, these colonialist attitudes about who controls us and who can speak for us, and then what we should do as a people. But that's being replaced now, and I am looking forward to working on all the things that have to take place to reintroduce our self-determination.
Well, I would underscore everything that President Obed has said. It's in attitudes and it's in structures. The overlay of a whole different conceptual system of governance in which all rights flowed from the crown is antithetical to the fact that Indigenous peoples have inherent rights, have always had inherent rights, and so having this whole structure overlaid over all the various Indigenous peoples that happen to reside in this space. So Inuit, yes, other First Nations of many types and many different structures and many different languages, and then as a result of contact, the Métis. The Métis across, again, the similar spaces. So that is the challenge that we face to overturn these structures and then overturn the attitudes too. So, you know, in my portfolio, I look at the criminal justice system. You know, the Indigenous peoples represent 5% of the Canadian population, yet they represent 24% of people who are incarcerated in federal institutions, and it's an even higher number in provincial institutions. Like, that's just shameful, right? And so how to from my perspective, how I have to try to identify the kinds of things in the criminal code that lead and the kinds of things in criminal procedure that lead to those results, and try to overturn them. That's step one. But step two is to try to find a way, working with people like President Obed and other leaders across Canada. And I have to point out, it's complex. You have to take into account the fact that there are significant distinctions. You saw President Obed's wonderful opening remarks about the Inuit. There are very different realities for First Nations, and very different realities amongst many First Nations, and then different realities for Métis. And so as a partner, if you will, or interlocutor, I've got to try to attack these colonial institutions. Like the Indian Act, it doesn't apply to the Inuit, as you know from the opening remarks. It doesn't apply to the James Bay Cree as a result of treaties. It does apply in other places. It is a structure that has caused a great deal of damage. Residential school policy, the 60s scoop, other things that have been tried and in error and have had tragic results, have been very unjust, both in terms of their application and their results. So trying to work to change that with Indigenous partners across Canada, and really listening at the very first level, listening to them, and listening to what their experience has been and how they would like to govern themselves and determine their own futures. I mean, that's the most important first step. And then I think the best metaphor is chipping away, and trying every step of the way to push the dialogue forward. So that's the challenge. There are other parts of the answer that I think we're all trying to figure out as we go along.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your insights. Moving on to our second question. How can we begin deconstructing these unjust systems and better support the individual needs of Indigenous peoples through radical policy transformation?
I've at ITK have been pushing for an Inuit Nunangat approach to policy. If you think about the jurisdictions of provinces and territories, and then you think about the federal structure, and you have departments, and you have 30-odd departments with as many ministers who all have mandate letters, who all have central direction through PMO and PCO, but have quite a bit of autonomy in the way that their particular departments engage with Indigenous peoples, and how those particular departments interpret, whether it's Supreme Court cases or whether it's government policy in regards to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. The only way that we can create a foundation of respect for Inuit, First Nations, and Métis policy is to be instructive, and also to be definitive about the foundations that we have already set in motion that we need everyone to comply with. I think that we are still in the Wild West, if you want to use that term, when it comes to how reconciliation works, and who gets to figure out what a reconciliation action is. Everyone wants to kind of go out in their own way and interpret in their own way, when there is a foundation, and the foundation has to be led, especially within government policy, by the land claim agreements, the historic treaties, the constructive arrangements in the UN language that we have with the government of Canada, but then also the decisions that we have made together to go forward in a shared path with the Prime Minister and with Cabinet. In provinces and territories, there are similar structures, there are similar agreements, and it really is trying to implement to the best of anyone's ability what has already happened and not recreate something through the leverage that an individual bureaucrat or individual minister might have through the nature of their position and the fact that nobody is going to call them on it if they just decide to go into it in a different direction in implementation of a core mandate. That is a lot of what I have to do with my job, is try to correct well-meaning people in positions of power who have said that they're going to do something that they feel is helpful, but is hugely problematic in many ways. There are other relationships, like the one that I have with Minister Lametti, where we talk about the issues that we want to do, and then we could do them. That is really the basis of the good relationship. Also, it is the knowledge of what has happened, and then the implications of what has happened on the conversation today. Land claims is a great example. These are constitutionally protected documents, agreements. They need to be systematically implemented, but in certain places at certain times, it's as if they don't exist. And that is the type of thing that really needs to stop. And it would be radical if it did stop.
Just building on that, I mean, from the perspective of a sort of non-Indigenous person in governance, step one, I have to listen and be respectful and understand, try to understand what has happened, try to understand the reality of the Indigenous person in front of me, and that reality will be different depending on who I'm speaking to, and then try to think through solutions and try to create structure in partnership with Indigenous peoples, and try to build the structures or adapt the structures or go around the structures, as the case may be, to get to a solution. We as a government have established bilateral mechanisms with Indigenous leadership across Canada. With the Inuit, it's the Inuit Crown Partnership, and those are a wonderful opportunity to listen and to hear firsthand what the challenges are, and to try to figure out solutions, and then to be held accountable in subsequent meetings for not having gotten there, or congratulated if we have. But they help us to work together in a very pragmatic way to take on problems from important critical problems on the ground, housing, for example, in criminal justice issues in my case, and then all the way up to the sort of most wide structural governance questions about how to govern. So those are helpful. Those kinds of ideas are helpful. And then from the perspective of a non-Indigenous person in public service, you have to embrace complexity. You have to understand that there are different peoples, there are different traditions, there are different histories, different histories with colonialism, different impacts of colonialism, all generally negative, but negative in different ways. And so you've got to try to keep all of those balls in the air as you try to move forward in partnership and again work on ideas to help fix very real problems. So it is, and you just have to, again, you just have to try to move the ball forward. You have to try to move the ball forward. You have to try to move the ball forward. And President Obed is right. Much of the challenge is communicating with my colleagues around the cabinet table and with departments. And my responsibility is to set the tone for my own ministry and my own department, and hopefully try to set an example for my colleagues around the cabinet table and work with them, again, finding allies, and then building in partnership with Indigenous leadership of various kinds. You know, you heard that a general description of the structure of Inuit Nunangat in President Obed's remarks. So there's one set of structures there, so working with leadership, President Obed, but also leaders from the four regions, and understanding their interaction, and then understanding how those regions interact with the territories, which are non-Indigenous governments, but that include Indigenous peoples, particularly in Nunavut. So it's complex. It's something you have to keep working on a daily basis, but it's really the only way forward, in partnership and understanding the complexity.
Thank you so much. Our next question is regarding the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So the Government of Canada recently took steps to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so how will this commitment and legislation impact national policymaking regarding Indigenous issues moving forward?
Maybe David, you can take this one first.
Okay. Well, I think modestly, it is a modest step, but an important step in terms of, again, pushing forward in addressing the problems that we've been talking about. So first of all, it is a United Nations declaration drafted 20 odd years ago, primarily by Indigenous leaders from around the world, including Indigenous leadership from Canada. Dr. Wilton Littlechild, a Cree person from Western Canada, former member of Parliament, was one of the leaders in the drafting of that document, which, again, as President Obed has pointed out, and and you can't repeat it often enough, it affirms the human rights that Indigenous peoples have always had, and it's a document about human rights and recognizing those rights as we ought to have done a long time ago. So in that sense, it's a very important symbolic step forward. What we're doing now is creating a structure to implement those rights and make sure ultimately that all federal law is in harmony with the principles that are espoused in that document. And so in that sense, it provides a roadmap for moving forward, provides a roadmap for dialogue. There's still a lot to do. We still need to implement structures of accountability so that when we don't get it right, we are responsible for correcting it and being told that we have to correct it by a court or a tribunal of some nature. And we need to convince, I hope, all the provinces and territories to do the same. There's a great deal of interest, but British Columbia has already implemented legislation to do this. We're hoping that other provinces, there is a great deal of interest in a number of provinces and territories, some skepticism in other provinces and territories. But again, working in partnership with Indigenous leadership, we think we can push this out. And I think the last point I'll make before turning it over to President Obed, it really does recognize, establish, and forces us in a responsible way to be in constant dialogue with Indigenous peoples. There is a basis of consent that is in that document for the self-determination of peoples and everything associated with it, whether it's how one runs one's daily life or how one participates in economic development. All of that needs to be done in a meaningfully collaborative way, and that document establishes those principles. It's up to us to operationalize them as we move forward, but it is a nice roadmap as well as symbol to I think get us to a better place. It's not perfect, but it's a good step, and it keeps pushing us in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree with the remarks from David. Just to add, there's a ton of symbolism in Canada upholding Indigenous people's rights, and also going out into the world across in UN settings, and being a good actor as a nation state in regards to Indigenous people's rights and the record on Indigenous people's rights. That has not been the case, and it has not been the case up until very, very recently. So if Canada wants to be a nation that is seen as respectful of all human rights, if Canada wants to be seen as a leader when it comes to progressive governance, then the path to that is through the implementation of UNDRIP, just as much as it is through the implementation of treaties and other constructive arrangements with Indigenous peoples, and then also solving the inequities of Indigenous peoples. And you can wrap all of those things up in different compartments, but the United Nations Declaration is something that is a beacon for all of the work that we're trying to do here in Canada, to ensure that we as Inuit, and also that First Nations and Métis, have self-determination, and that also that there aren't massive inequalities between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in this country in all forms of socioeconomic status, and also in the politics and the governance. Minister Lametti talked about the justice system and the overrepresentation of the justice system for Indigenous people. We also have similar statistics for a whole host of socioeconomic indicators that are just unacceptable. The idea that there's 52% overcrowding in Inuit homes compared to, I believe, 7% for non-Indigenous Canadians. Our tuberculosis rate is 300 times the rate of all other Canadians born in Canada. These are the types of socioeconomic status indicators that show we have so much to do when it comes to living up to the ideals that we espouse as a nation when we go internationally. That's a long-standing complaint of Indigenous peoples, that we have just been swept under the rug in many ways when it comes to Canada's record, whether it's on gender or on human rights. These are things that have to be forcibly addressed and overcome. A big part of UNDRIP and the lobby that Inuit had before the first reading was introduced was to try to get some form of recourse and remedy within the bill. And that just basically means that if an Indigenous person or an Indigenous people are having their human rights violated in this country, that this legislation would allow for some sort of mechanism to address that, that might not be available through contemporary status quo means, or that even if there are options available for Indigenous peoples today, that we can create a structure that is specifically constituted to address the very difficult and complicated space of Indigenous law and the application of the Constitution and all pieces of legislation on the inherent rights of Indigenous people. It is something that is incredibly complex, and something that there is a massive track record of inability to grasp those consequences or those scenarios when ruling on a violation of human rights. So we are really hopeful that this bill can pass. We're so pleased that the provisions in the bill have been constructed so as to take in the positions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in the first reading. And we are hopeful that the subsequent actions from the implementation of the legislation will bring about the change that we all want. Again, though, just because there is legislation, it wouldn't necessarily mean that then immediately we get to that space. I think what's important for everyone involved here is that we have to work hard every step of the way to see these things into reality. And the legislation is but a part of that sea change that we are trying to force upon this country, and want this country to embrace and believe in. And I would say that the majority of Canadians do believe in this work. They don't necessarily understand how this work might come to pass, but I think this legislation is a positive step towards that.
Thank you so much. And then moving on to our final question, what are some practical steps that we as students can take to effectively advocate for Indigenous peoples' rights in Canada and the rights of Indigenous peoples around the world?
It's a good question. It is so situational. Everyone has lived experience and some form of understanding of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in this country. Even though First Nations, Inuit, and Métis only make up 5% of Canada's population, you think of our presence in society, whether it's the name of the town you came from, the name of your province, the symbols that you associate with what Canada is. Indigenous peoples are woven into the fabric of Canadians. It has been a pretty dysfunctional relationship because the ideology, like the imagination of who Indigenous peoples are, is so, and also the benevolence that Canadians feel that they have had towards some Indigenous peoples has been so misplaced that sometimes it's really hard to start these conversations about, well, what can I do now? I think for a lot of people, it's actively unlearning or taking those views that you might have had about Indigenous peoples and forcibly accepting that they might be wrong, and that you have to figure out how to replace that with knowledge, with truth from Indigenous peoples, and also just the respect for Indigenous governance. This goes hand in hand with what I've been saying earlier. One of the things that has been used against Indigenous peoples up until this day is to belittle our governance models and to say that they don't exist, or that we are just some subset of special interest groups, or that, oh, well, we only represent X number of people, or, oh, they only had 30% people who came out to vote, so that leader really isn't the... This is just another way of dismissing Indigenous people's rights. Okay, so, Doug Ford wins an election in Ontario. There are many other people in Ontario that probably didn't vote for him, but they don't just say that then Ontario doesn't exist anymore, or that he doesn't have the ability to rule in Ontario. The same thing with Trudeau nationally. They don't just stop believing in a prime minister because the person that they wanted to win didn't win. Whereas with Indigenous governance and Indigenous positions, often we can just it can be explained away through a convenient set of reasons why the position of an Indigenous organization doesn't stand. So I always say that our governance models are evolving, that whether it's Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami or whether it's our land claim organizations or whatever other representational organizations and structures we've created, they can always be improved. But I don't think it's the place of an average Canadian to reject Indigenous governance. And also just to say that that is the space for Indigenous peoples, and that you will meet Indigenous people who will have widely disparate views on politics, on history, on what you should do as a non-Indigenous person. That's life, right? Like that is just like accepting that Indigenous peoples aren't homogeneous is another really important concept, and that you have to apply that understanding to what you hear and how you support Indigenous peoples. Sometimes people just want to use my name and say, well, Natan said this, so how can you believe in this? This is a completely different opinion. It's like, well, we're people. My peers, my fellow Inuit, are not going to believe the same things I do all the time. We may have things that bring us together, things that tie us together, but I do think in 2021, young people have to just say, just accept that we have the breadth of interests and realities that any other society does. And that's okay. Like maybe people want to live in Montreal or Ottawa. Maybe they weren't coerced here. Maybe people want to, do things that aren't necessarily traditional within our society. I would encourage people not to lead questions and interactions with Indigenous people about what they should be doing or how they should be living or how they should look. These are the things that are hurtful to the type of progress that we want to make.
Thank you, Natan. I would underscore that again. I'll speak from a non-Indigenous perspective, and a lot based on my own experience. Which, look, what I believe now and what I believe and what I have come to understand only partially about Indigenous peoples was not what I was taught. And hopefully you're in a better place now. Hopefully education systems are better than they were in substance when they deal with these various issues, but they're not going to be perfect either. So I think the first thing we all need to do, and I need to continue to do, is to learn to listen and learn to listen well. Learn to listen to the person you're interacting with, and understand the diversity and embrace that complexity. Know that if you're speaking to a Wet'suwet'en person, their experience is going to be very different, both within that nation, depending on what they happen to be, what their life happens to be within that territory, or not in that territory necessarily, or an Inuit person from again, it very different from Nunatsiavut to Nunavik to Nunavut. I mean, and then Métis people. So understand that there are differences. Learn to listen in order to try to understand as best you can. Learn the history as best you can. Challenge sources. Don't believe everything you read in any one source, particularly on social media, but elsewhere as well. And so do your best in that dialogue to understand better. Once you're there, realize you still have a lot more to learn, but move forward anyway, and be involved in whatever capacity you're capable, and whatever opportunities present themselves. It can be in just teaching other people or helping other people to understand in ordinary conversation that when they use a stereotype about an Indigenous person, you know, all X's are Y's. Well, no, they're not. Think about this. Think about the impact, for example, of residential schools. Think about the impact of the 60s scoop. Think about the impact of the imposition of a government or systems of government that you never invited to come. And indeed, we're quite welcoming in a very cordial way, and then had everything upended. So understanding that history, understanding and doing your best to communicate that to other people, and then taking active roles where you can. Whether it can be elected office, it can be elected leadership, it can also be non-elected. It can be working for movements or political parties or other structures that help to advance whatever particular aspect of a particular cause that is important to you. So embrace those, but always keep an eye open that you haven't necessarily gotten it right wherever you are, and that there is still change. There are still things that you don't understand, and that you have to keep listening and stay in dialogue. Again, much of the change has to be driven in dialogue, listening to Indigenous peoples and hearing and seeing and trying to understand their realities as they are telling us those realities. Again, I'm speaking from the perspective of a non-Indigenous person, and working together to try to get to a better place. I mean, that it is simple and yet brutally difficult, but you just have to keep trying and accept that you're not always going to be successful, but get up the next morning and keep trying. And that really is, I think, the only way to move forward. And that would be the advice that I would give to all of you, which is keep an open mind, keep listening, keep trying to see opportunities to help, but always realizing that you've got more to learn. You have more. We all have more to learn every day.
Thank you so much.
I hope the words you heard today from Minister Lametti and President Obed have encouraged thought and dialogue on advocacy-driven policymaking. We are so grateful to hear from them and to share their message with you all. As we enter McMUN this weekend, I hope you find your committees exciting and engaging, that you learn how to be a better advocate and consider how to better serve your communities. Above all, I hope you make lasting connections and friendships, whether they be in the virtual committee room or at an online social event. If there is anything this past year has taught us, it is that there is nothing as valuable as these connections we have with each other. Please remember, if there is any way our secretariat team can support you in this endeavor along the way, we are here for you. And finally, I would like to thank each and every one of you for your participation in this year's conference. I know this past year has presented unique challenges for all of us, and the entire McMUN team is so thankful to your commitment to working together to improve our reality. We are so happy to have you here with us this weekend. With this in mind, I am excited to officially declare McMUN 2021 in session.